All right, so now that I've finished going over and given a high-level overview of each component, we'll start unboxing them and putting them together. Before we start doing that though, you probably noticed there's no monitor, there's no peripherals such as keyboard, speakers, headphone. Those are separate from the build. That's not going to be included. Once we actually get the computer built, we'll connect obviously the monitor and the keyboard because that's required to install Windows. But for the actual build, we'll just be focusing on the actual desktop. As far as tools, really the only thing you're going to need is a set of screwdrivers. So I've got 2 different screwdrivers here for the components, and that should be it. Everything else should be included. All the screws should be included with the various components that we're going to be using. And I think that covers everything, so we're going to go ahead and get started. So like as I was saying, with our build, the motherboard is really kind of the building block. So that's where everything gets plugged into. So we're going to start by unboxing that first. Obviously, these are all computer components. They're not meant to be handled a lot, so you want to be pretty careful when holding them. There is the small chance that static electricity can build up. All the components typically come packaged in packaging that protects against static electricity, so you want to be careful once you take it out of that. So touching it as minimally as possible. As well as making sure you're wearing shoes so that you're not wearing socks on carpet, because that can build up static electricity and actually damage the components. And if you're really worried, you could get an electrostatic wristband, which can further help protect against the buildup of static electricity in your body. But that is typically overkill, and it's a very small chance that you actually would damage a component by not using that. So I'm not going to use one today, but that is something you can use should you be that concerned. So we'll go ahead and take the motherboard out of its packaging here. And you can see it's a pretty big piece of hardware. Our CPU will be socketed here, and then we've got 4 slots for our RAM, and then this actually can hold 2 different graphics cards should we ever want to do that, but our primary graphics card and only graphics card for this build will go here. And then we've got our hard drive will actually be plugged in underneath this heatsink here. We'll have to remove that. And then all these connections down here are for various connectors with the case, the power, fans, lighting, and so forth. And I'll be going over those once we get to them later on in the build process. So I'm going to go ahead and put this down here right on the table, and then start pulling out some of the other things included in the box. A few cables here, LED strip, wireless extenders for the Wi-Fi adapter, which is actually built into this motherboard. Not all motherboards have them, but this motherboard came with a wireless card already integrated into it, and so it comes with an antenna that we can put onto that to improve the wireless signal. Then a disc with driver installation, and that should be pretty much it. So I'm going to go ahead and get this box out of the way, and actually, to make it easier, I'm going to go ahead and put our motherboard on the box to make it a little easier for you guys to see. So the next thing to do is going to be start getting out our CPU. So we've got our AMD Ryzen processor, comes already enclosed in a hard packaged covering to protect it. This is by far the most delicate of all the components. You can see, maybe it's kind of hard to see with the plastic covering, but it's got pins. We got to make sure we do not touch those at all, because if we bend or break any of those pins, the entire CPU is ruined. So we got to make sure we don't pick it up or touch the bottom of that, as well as the other side as well, because that's where the heat sink will be attached to. So we don't want to make sure we get any oil from our hands on that. So the best practice is to pick it up by the edges. So when we take off the covering, we'll be picking it up by the edges and then socketing into the CPU socket on the motherboard. But it's worth noting, as long as it's in this covering, it's fully protected and we don't have to really worry too much about it. So we don't want to take it out of the covering until we're fully ready to put it into the motherboard. And then the only other thing that's included with the CPU is the heatsink. This will go directly onto the processor once we socket onto the motherboard. And this is what keeps it cool. This is what keeps it cool and keeps it from overheating when it's running. And that should be it for that box. So we'll go ahead and get this out of the way. Now it'll be time to open up our CPU and get it ready to be seated onto the motherboard. So packaging opens pretty easily. And before we're ready to actually pick it up, we want to prepare our motherboard to be seated for the processor. We want to prepare it we want to prepare our motherboard for the CPU to be seated into that socket. And so there's a few things we need to do. The first thing is we need to remove these plastic brackets that are screwed down. Some are just, and these brackets are here for a couple different reasons. First of all, they're here for some heat sinks. Some heat sinks use these brackets to be attached to. But our current heatsink that came with our CPU doesn't actually need them, so we have to get them off. And another reason they put that on there is just to protect the motherboard and keep it protected while it's being shipped. So for our purposes, we'll be taking this off, and it moves pretty easily. Don't really have to put much pressure. We'll take those screws right off. There's 4 of them. 2 for each bracket. There goes the first bracket. Then we'll loosen the final screw. This should just lift right out. There we go. And so all that's remaining is just the 4 holes, and we'll eventually be lining up. Once we put our CPU in there, our heatsink has got 4 screws, and those 4 screws, you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, we'll be lining up with those, and we'll be screwing those down. So the only other bit of prep we need to do before we put our CPU in there is just to lift this little lock here, which is pretty simple. It just lifts up here, just like that. And now we're going to be ready to socket our CPU. So like I said, we want to pick it up by the edges. And you can see up close here, you can see the various pins. And then on the other side, this is where our heatsink and thermal paste will be touching, and that's where the cooling will take place. The heat will transfer from the CPU to the heatsink, and the heatsink will then disperse that heat, and that's how the processor is cooled. Something to keep in mind is that, and this goes for also into Intel CPUs as well, is you have to make sure you line up the various corners into the right place on the socket. So if you notice, there's a little triangle there on one of the four corners of the CPU. You want that to match up with one of the corners on the motherboard. So you can see you've got the four corners, and you see another bracket or another marking right there that matches up with this. So we want to match that up with that when we drop it into place. And it dropped in place pretty easily. So the only other thing we need to do once we drop it in is to then lower this lock. There's going to be a little bit more pressure this time now that the CPU is socketed, and that's okay. So we push it down, and there's a little locking mechanism underneath. We pull it underneath that, and we're good to go. Now the next part is then installing the heatsink. So this is just lining up the screws to the various holes for the heatsink to be installed in. Keeping a note, there is a power cable for the fan, so we want that to be lined up, and that power cable gets plugged in here. This header for this fan gets plugged in here, so we want that to be close to here. So we want to make sure that it's lined like this. Just make sure that it's sitting on top of the holes, and that'll be time to screw them in. And it's important not to screw one in all the way. We want to be applying even pressure just because the CPU is delicate. So we want to go around slowly and fasten them a little bit before we get them completely fastened. So we'll fasten that a little bit and just keep working our way around. All right, so now we've got the heatsink screwed in fairly tight. Once it's screwed in and fastened completely, should be able to pick up by that. Looks like we've got a pretty good connection. It's holding, so that's good. And the only other thing to do with the heatsink is to plug it in on the header up here. And looks like we're there. So we've got the motherboard partially prepped. We've got the CPU in place. We've got the heatsink in place. Now it'll be time to look at the RAM. So we've got, for our build, we've got two 8GB RAM modules for a total of 16 gigabytes of RAM. RAM's pretty straightforward to install. It's just going to really just snap into place into any of these 4 modules. The only confusing part is really just referencing which slots to use, and that's where you're going to have to reference your motherboard guide. We do want to make sure that we're using dual channel memory because we did buy dual channel modules. So that means we want to make sure we're using the dual channel memory slots to get that dual channel bandwidth. Should just kind of snap right into place. So that's the first one. Then we've got our second module. All right, it looks like it's locked into place. So now we've got the RAM done. The next piece of equipment will be our M.2 hard drive. So we'll go ahead and get that out. And so hard drives have changed a lot over the last few years. And as little as 3 or 4 or 5 years ago, people were using SATA drives and the old just spinning mechanical hard drives. Now they have, hard drives that are not much bigger than a stick of gum. These are a lot faster, much faster read and write speeds. The installation is much simpler. There's no SATA cables, no power cables. This plugs right into an M.2 slot on the motherboard. In order to prep the motherboard, though, we've got to remove this heatsink on the motherboard before we can install it. So we'll go ahead and do that. Heatsink comes right off. And our hard drive will get plugged right in there. You can see the connection matches the connection there. And so it'll get inserted kind of at a 30-degree angle. Apply a little bit of pressure and then push down. You can see there's a little screw hole that lines up with the notch on the end of the hard drive module. And there was a screw that came with the motherboard that will go in there. All right, so that is now installed. We'll now reinstall the heatsink over that. Go ahead and take this plastic off here and over here. So the next thing is going to be looking at our power supply and looking at what parts we're going to need for that. So I'm going to go ahead and pull that out. Set the graphics card down over here. We'll be covering that later, but right now, the next step is going to be getting out that power supply and seeing what exactly we need from that. It's got its own little bag here. So this is it. It's got a fan for all the heat that it's going to be generating. And then it's got power cable. This is will be facing out of the computer. This is what we'll plug, and this will go directly into the wall or directly into the power or surge protector. That'll turn the computer on. And then this is all of our, where we'll plug all of our cables in. This is what we call a modular power supply, so we only have to plug in the cables that we actually need. So as far as cables that we're going to need, let's go ahead and pull everything that came in the box on the table here. Got some screws here to help fasten it to the inside of the case. The cables that we know we're going to need for sure. Connections to the motherboard. That's going to be plugged in right here. That'll be powering the motherboard. So we know we're going to need that. So we can go ahead and plug that in. That's going to go here. It's actually got two connections. That's going to be plugged in here. And then there's another connection here that will get plugged in. And then again, once we actually have the motherboard installed inside the case, we'll run this and plug it in there. Let's see what else we've got here. This will be for fans, so we know we will need that potentially. So we'll leave that here. This is for the CPU. We know we definitely need that, so we can go ahead and plug that in into the CPU slot. It's marked on the power supply. This is for a SATA drive, which we're not using, so we don't have to worry about that. So we can toss that in the box. Don't need it. This is also for peripherals, so potential more fans. We might need it. Could be used for an upgrade later on. At this point, we'll just put it in the box for now. Again, this is another SATA cable. Don't need it for now, so we'll put that in the box. This is for our graphics card. Definitely need that. So we'll go ahead and plug this into the power supply. So plug it. That will go into VGA 1. That's going to be for our video card. So that goes in there, and then the other end will go into our video card. So at this point, we've got pretty much all the necessary cables installed into our power supply. And at this point, the next phase of the build process will be to prep our case and install the motherboard. So we'll go ahead and get rid of this and clean up our area to get that ready for the case prep and motherboard installation. It's pretty simple. We'll want to go ahead and take this guard off. Most graphics cards ship with this little protective guard over the connection. So we'll take that off. And you can see the connections here. They line up with the slot here. And we're just going to So now it'll be time to screw the screws back in to reinforce this graphics card to make sure that it doesn't fall out. So we're taking the screws from the panels that we removed and screwing those back in. All right, so now we have our video card installed. That's really all of the internal components that we have to do today, other than the power supply. So we're gonna go ahead and move our case upright. And now it's gonna be time to prep and install our power supply. We've already partially have done that because we already selected all of the cables that we needed for our build. Those have already been connected. So the big thing will be inserting it into the case and then running the power to each individual component and connecting that. All right, so now we've got our power supply firmly secured inside the case. It's gonna be now it's gonna be time to start connecting all of our components to the power. So first thing is we connect that motherboard, the big 24-pin motherboard connector. So we're gonna run it from the back of the case, and we're gonna feed it through this hole in the motherboard here, which is designed for cable management. Through here. And we're gonna plug it in there. Actually, we're gonna turn it over on its side to make sure we get good pressure on that. So we've plugged that in. Now we'll go ahead and power our graphics card. So it's got an 8-pin connector there. And we already plugged that into we already plugged the necessary cable into our power supply. We're now gonna run that through this opening down here. And that'll get plugged in here. Now this is actually a 6-pin connector with an optional 8-pin. The reason for that is because some graphics cards use a 6-pin power connector and some use an 8-pin. So a lot of power supplies give you that 6-pin and then an optional 8-pin so that if you have a 6-pin connector, you're not stuck. So we'll be plugging both into our video card. There we go, we got power to our video card now. So the next thing will be our CPU. And it's a little hard to see, but our CPU is gonna be up here. There's actually 2 connectors. They do have another 4-pin connector if you're using a really powerful CPU, or if you're doing a very complicated setup where you've got 2 CPUs, which we do not. So we're just going to be using the 8-pin connector here and plugging that in. And similar to the video card, they actually gave us 2 4-pin connectors, which because some CPUs need 8 pins, some need 4. Ours needs 8, so we'll be using both of those.